I think it's really important. I think that we need to have these conversations. And so I am all for that. Oh, my baby. Oh, my poor baby. Okay. Good morning.
Good morning. I saw one of your, I don't know if you're doing other presentations, but I saw one of your presentations yesterday.
Karen, you're not, we can't hear you, so I'm not sure if you're trying to talk.
Can you hear me now? No. No. Can you hear me now, Joan? Hi, Joan, can you hear me now?
Oh, so, okay. All right, Karen, ignore me because my volume was down because I'm an idiot.
No problem at all. I was going to say, I saw one of your presentations.
I know, I'm glad someone in the chat said that they could hear you because I tend to like take the volume down and then I forget because.
It's all good.
I mean, I'll just chalk it up to pandemic failure. And I feel like that is fair.
It's totally fair in this day and age. Completely.
As I chug my venti cup.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, what is the presentation on? Okay, give me a second. So this morning's presentations, well, this morning's 9 a.m. session is on intersections of gender and race.
Mm-hmm.
And we have an awesome panel. All right, good morning. I'm Joan Antunes. I will be hosting your panel. Actually, I'll be hosting much of stream 3 today. A couple of things. We have set the presentations at 10 minutes, but I will not be muting you or coming in like the voice of God and saying you have 1 minute. I feel like we have enough ability, and we have 4 presentations. So if we can keep within 10, maybe a standard deviation above or below the 10 minutes, I don't need to feel anxiety ridden and telling you to shut up or mute you, because this is not the debate. So it's cool. I'm not going to really interject. I'm going to let y'all do what you do best, which is share your awesome research. Okay. We can do in order of the program. Cassandra, you ready to go? Ready to take over? Okay, perfect. I'm going to shut up and mute myself and turn off my camera and enjoy all of your awesome presentations.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Let me go ahead and start sharing. If you'll let me. There it goes. Okay. So I wanted to share a little bit of my findings from my dissertation research. It's called Remnants of Chattel, Black Women, Sex Trafficking in the Criminal Legal System. And I'm a PhD candidate in my final year at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Uh-oh, what happened? Okay. So I have 3 research questions, but in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on one, which is my actual second question or third question. How does the criminal legal system interact with Black women and girls who have been trafficked? And just a quick overview of the method. So these were based on qualitative interviews through Zoom due to social distancing with Black women survivors. I recruited them from survivor leaders, some of whom I personally know, nonprofits and social services that pass an advertisement for my study, and snowball sampling. And the requirements were just had to be 18 or above 18 at the time of the interview, no longer in prostitution, and identify as a Black woman. They had to sign an informed consent form, and all information was de-identified. And there's a real quick overview of my theoretical framework. The primary one here that I use to really center my analyses of the Black women survivors in the study. I use Black feminist criminology, and that involves 4 tenets. So the first one is that oppression is delineated through social structures. This is used to place the multiplicative oppression as faced by Black women in the frame of analyses as I look at their lives before, during, and after exploitation, specifically how they interact with agents of the criminal legal system. So police officers, judges, defense attorneys, prosecutors, everybody in between that they interact with in their respective juries. And then 2, Black community and culture. So understanding of how Black women understand their experiences through their own cultural frames as Black women, as well as Black women with other pieces of their identity of whatever they thought was significant to their experience. 3, intimate and familial relations. So looking at how these networks influence or interact with their trafficking experience, specifically looking at how if there was, say, maybe a familial relationship that interacted or caused the onset of their exploitation, or if there was an intimate and familial relationship that actually helped with their exiting. So anything significant there. And then lastly, looking at Black women as individuals. So I'm careful not to homogenize this particular group because they're already homogenized enough. But the goal of this research is to really sort of flesh out and understand the nuances of Black women and girl survivors of sex trafficking and how they interact with the criminal legal system, both as victims and offenders. And to do that and to do justice to their experiences, especially to their respective trauma and their healing, I had to look at them as individual, not couch them into a large homogenized group. There's diversity even in a group that has the same cultural background. And just really quick, there was 13 total participants I have so far. So just some background, age, demographic. The majority of women in the study were. I mixed these Susan things up. I'm sorry. It's really early where I'm at my time here in my time zone. The majority actually started off as minors, so I need to switch to 7 and 9 here. And then the 9 of them were minors when they began. And then the majority of them were adults when it ended. So only 2 of them started as minors and ended as minors as well. And then the majority of them were exploited after the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act that was passed in 2000. This is significant because this is sort of the concrete law that was passed that was designed to combat contemporary human trafficking. And specifically, it's significant here for 2 reasons. One, it was actually very explicit that said youth could not be criminalized for their exploitation. And 2, it really laid the groundwork, skeleton foundation for states to actually pass or beefing up their already existing trafficking laws. So the majority of them were already trafficked after the TVPA was passed. So I want to focus on, this is a really rich data set. I want to focus on their courtroom experiences. Specifically, I want to look at obstructions to justice. So the majority of them said that courts were not helpful in exiting their exploitation at all. 9 were incarcerated for their crimes related to being trafficked or otherwise exploited. And then the Commons responses said that courts denied them being able to use the victim of trafficking defense, so affirmative defense in some states. They were not allowed to introduce any sort of evidence of their victimization that could possibly mitigate the sentences that they were facing. Judges and juries were hostile to them or otherwise unsympathetic to their plights. Judges refused defense attorneys' requests for diversion programs, even for minors. Only one in my entire sample was allowed to go into a diversion program instead of a prison. And then judges refused to allow previous histories of abuse or proof of forced fodder, corrosion, the real highlights examples of what constitutes trafficking, into the courtroom. So the majority of the women in here had, with the exception of one actually, so 12 of the women had previous histories of sexual abuse, physical abuse, and different sorts of abuses that their defense attorneys attempted to introduce into court, specifically to prove the psychological control that their trafficker had. None of them were allowed to use it. And I just wanted to give a brief anecdote here from a woman whose name I named Amani. She's an adult sex trafficking survivor with one trafficker. And she said, I remember crying as the DA was trying to debate the fact that I wasn't a victim. He had a picture of me in this super skanky schoolgirl outfit my trafficker would use when we posted ads and said, look at her, she's smiling, she's not a victim. It was just crazy how non-trauma informed and non-empathetic the court system is with African-American survivors of human trafficking. Why do I get a prison term, but Rebecca gets a program? I was convicted by a jury of not my peers. Amani was actually convicted for kidnapping and intent to prostitute, and then pimping and pandering, for being in the car with her trafficker as he moved her and several of his other victims to another location. So she was convicted as a co-conspirator, even though she was a victim as well. And then some positive highlights from their courtroom experience, even if they weren't helpful, they did have some pieces there that they said were actually very helpful for them later on as catalysts of access, even when the court itself was not. So survivors said supportive defense attorneys and proactive prosecutors were catalysts for access. So ones who had extensive knowledge in human trafficking or sex trafficking itself, and prosecutors who really tried to introduce a lot of mitigating circumstances. It was usually the judges that were throwing things out in their experiences. Defense attorneys were given the most praise. A lot of them just praise and love their defense attorneys, especially for taking time to understand the trauma of poor Black women and girls who were trafficked. And this was true even if they were incarcerated as a result of them going to court. And I want to introduce us to Amina, 32. She was an adult survivor with multiple pimps. And she said, I got locked up and my lawyer would try to talk to me. I was very, very resistant of talking to anybody, and she's seen that. She said, I don't want to bring anybody in to talk to you about what's happening. I just want to bring in somebody to speak with you. I love her to death. She's a fabulous person. Amina was incarcerated for drug and prostitution, despite the fact that she actually was one of the, she had several traffickers and they knew every single one of the traffickers, she said, according to her anecdotes here. But her defense attorney actually brought in a counselor who specialized specifically in domestic violence, who had training in human trafficking, because it was her boyfriend who was trafficking her. So having that counselor, having someone to actually talk with her like a person, she said, was incredibly helpful for her. And then incarceration, the majority of them have been incarcerated at some point in time. They range from different sentences, primarily because they were sent to prison multiple different times. So here's Amani again, and she described being incarcerated as the same experience as being trafficked all over again. So she said, I went from being held captive to captivity again. Same system, different faces. And I want to introduce us to a new one. Dinah is 42, child and sex trafficking with multiple traffickers. She said, I killed my pimp in 2006 and went to a maximum security prison. I was sentenced to 10 years for second-degree murder. I felt so discouraged because they didn't care he was my trafficker. They said instead of shooting him, I should have called the police. And I told them I've called the police my entire life and nobody ever came for me. Dinah ended up serving 15 years in jail for self-defense killing of her trafficker. And the state that this was in, they don't have the stand your ground law or a self-defense law. So she was charged with second-degree murder. Dinah, from the anecdotes that she relayed to me, had for years attempted to call the police and use the police as a way of getting help. But according to what she told me, they were never helpful and oftentimes actually returned her to her trafficker, especially when she was still a child. And then I also want to say real quick, Misogynoir, this is a specified hatred of Black women and Black women's bodies and their experiences. So this is Maya. We're going on to just the criminal legal system overall. And she just said that because she was a Black woman, she believes that no one believed that the police and social workers didn't care about her at all. That's why shared trafficking situation was extended for so long. She was in there for, I believe, 8 years. But she has filed says that they don't care about women on the street when it comes to sex trafficking, and they tell us all the time, we know you Black girls aren't going to tell on your pin, so we're not going to bother. They're trash. The police, they're effing trash and racist. It's a lot of white privilege, and they don't care about Black women. And Sharia was trafficked from her by her family, and then later on through an orphanage as a child. And she said that being Black has really affected her, because she really thinks that her life would have been different if she had been born white or just any other race besides Black. So she said that her re-traumatization from the criminal legal system will not have happened had she been anyone other than a little Black girl. And then just real quick, because I'm running out of time, the women in my study offer different cornerstones for conceptualizing justice themselves, both for inside and outside of institutions. Overall, they don't view the criminal legal system, even the ones that shared positive experiences, don't believe that the criminal legal system is adequately designed to give justice to sex trafficked Black women and girls. So here in this little graphic, we have the cornerstone of justice. The first one is accountability of Black men, because all of their traffickers were Black men. Encourage protectionism for Black women and girls, which means believe, uplift, value, and love them, both in inter-society and then societal in general. Stop having police interview victims. They were all very clear about that. And then the criminal legal system and anti-trafficking agents require a racial justice and equity reckoning, starting with chattel enslavement. So they wanted there to be more in-depth training of race and racism and the history beyond that. So they said beyond anti-racism training, beyond diversity and inclusion training, because it wasn't working. The majority of the women also work in anti-trafficking nonprofits and had to sit in these rooms when these trainings went on. So they just flat out said they are not very helpful. And then that's it. Thank you all very much. I'm sorry I stumbled a little bit.
It was awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your research. Just a little, check-in. We will do questions at the end. We do have a Q&A section. It's probably a lot easier for me to monitor the Q&A, but if for some reason the Q&A doesn't work for you, you can put it in the chat and I will monitor it as well. Thank you so much, Cassandra, for the awesome presentation. Peter and Ryan, y'all ready to roll? Perfect.
All right, can you all see that? Yes, okay, good. All right, well, good morning, everybody. My name is Peter Lehmann. I'm an assistant professor at Sam Houston State University, and today I'll be talking about a project that I'm working on with Ryan Meldrum at Florida International University. And the focus is on heterogeneous effects of race and ethnicity across Hispanic and Caribbean subgroups. And our focus is going to be on school discipline. If I can turn the page. Our focus is going to be on school discipline. And we know that there's this massive body of research out there already on the criminalization of school discipline and how school punishments are not racially equitable. And lots of prior studies have found that minority youth are more likely to experience suspension, expulsion, and office referrals than similar white youth. And there's also some research which shows that the effects of race and ethnicity are moderated by gender, but whether those disparities are expected to be stronger or weaker among males or females remains a bit unclear. But theoretically, to explain these disparities, scholars have emphasized the importance of things like racialized attitudes, implicit biases, and cognitive heuristics. And this sort of fits into the broader theoretical framework of the critical race perspective, which points to school behavioral standards as not race neutral, but rather as socializing students to view culturally white behaviors as normative and to conform to them accordingly. So within the school discipline literature, it's clear that these broad racial and ethnic categories that we often use in our research of Black, Hispanic, white, etc., may not necessarily be all that helpful or informative. And the authors of a recent study in the American Educational Research Journal argue that there is an increasingly urgent need to investigate within racial group variation, given the widening heterogeneity of racial groups. However, how these school discipline disparities that we've just talked about might vary by racial or ethnic subgroup, especially in concert with gender, is somewhat theoretically unclear, but here's several possibilities. So first, from the so-called exotic threat perspective, members of subgroups that maybe are less commonly encountered might be perceived as more threatening than subgroups that are more commonly encountered. And second, there's this notion of stereotype lift, which is sort of in contrast to the first perspective, where less numerous group may experience various benefits because they're identified as distinct from the broader outgroup. And then finally, it's possible that appearance and skin tone may be paramount, such that ethnic identity just doesn't really matter all that much because school staff consider youth as a rather homogeneous group stratified according to something like skin color. So the goal of the present study is to explore these issues. And in this study, we explore two research questions. The first, are there differences in the likelihood of experiencing a school suspension according to students' racial or ethnic identity? And then second, do the effects of membership in these racial or ethnic subgroups on the likelihood of school suspension, do those effects vary by gender? So the data for this study is the 2018 Florida Youth Substance Abuse Survey. This is a phenomenal data set. It's a cross-sectional survey of public middle school and high school students in the state of Florida. It's conducted annually. And it's important to emphasize that Florida provides really unique context in which to examine these relationships, given the notable racial and ethnic diversity of the state's population. And the data are also exceptionally beneficial because the sample size of more than 54,000 observations is so large that it allows us to disaggregate the sample by race and ethnicity very precisely. So our dependent variable captures whether students reported having been suspended from school at least once in the past 12 months, and 9.3% of those 54,000 students were coded as one. Our independent variables are race and ethnicity, which we categorize in three categories. We actually have two different sets of analyses, which you'll see in just a second. One that uses white non-Hispanics as the reference category, and the other that uses non-Hispanic Blacks as the reference category. And then also we're interested in gender as well. In terms of our control variables, we include everything we possibly can, whether English is the primary language spoken at home, academic achievement, delinquency, bullying, gang membership, neighborhood disorder, low self-control, unstructured socializing, parental monitoring, everything that was possible to include based on the survey we included. And to deal with missing data, we use multiple imputation by chained equations, or MICE. And we removed cases that had missing data on the dependent variable originally, thus producing our final sample size of about 54,000 observations. But here are the descriptive statistics for those 13 racial and ethnic categories. This is just the frequency distribution. So obviously, non-Hispanic whites and non-Hispanic Blacks are the most numerous. They're at the top there, while at the very bottom, Haitians, West Indians, and Dominicans are the least numerous in the data set. That's not all that surprising. However, because the sample size is so large, we're still dealing with, in the data, around 700 Dominican students, around 1,000 West Indian students, and about 1,200 Haitian students. So regarding the analyses moving forward, we estimated multi-level logistic regression models that accounted for clustering of the 54,000 students within 685 schools. But because we're dealing with a lot of covariates, we're dealing with odds ratios and odds ratios of interaction terms, the output from those models is a bit hard to digest. So what I'll be showing you instead is the predicted probabilities of suspension, specifically the adjusted predictions at the means of the covariates. So these estimates here are actually among males only, which were calculated from a model estimating those multiplicative interactions between the 13 racial groups and gender. And we see that non-Hispanic Blacks have the highest predicted probability of being suspended. They're sort of at the top there, followed by Haitians, and then Dominicans and West Indians, and then followed by some of the Hispanic subgroups, but with Puerto Rican youth at the top there. And then at the bottom, non-Hispanic whites, Mexicans, and Asians are the least likely to be suspended, which sort of emphasizes just how important it is to disaggregate Hispanic ethnicity in this way, given the vast differences there. But now we look at the marginal effects at the means, which tell us whether those discrete differences in those predicted probabilities are statistically significant. And the first comparison here is with non-Hispanic whites. So that sort of dark reddish bar there indicates that it's the reference group. So all of the other 12 groups are compared to that. And we see that compared to white male students, we're still talking about males, compared to white male students, non-Hispanic Blacks and Haitians are significantly more likely to be suspended from school. And male Asian students are less likely to be suspended than white male students. However, we also observe that the only Hispanic subgroup that is more likely to be suspended from school compared to whites among males is actually Puerto Rican students. Now we do the same thing, but with non-Hispanic Blacks as the reference group. And we see that all the subgroups are statistically significantly less likely to be suspended than this subgroup, except Haitians, Dominicans, West Indians, and Caribbean youth. So those four subgroups at the top have a sort of statistically similar predicted probability of experiencing a suspension from school. And then when we look at these same relationships among females specifically, we see the same pattern, but obviously the risk of suspension is somewhat more muted for all 13 of these subgroups, which sort of makes sense because females in general are less likely to be suspended than males. But we still see that Haitians, non-Hispanic Blacks, West Indians, and Dominicans are at the top there, followed by Puerto Ricans again, and then all the Hispanic subgroups. And like with male students, white and Asian females have the lowest predicted probability of suspension, which is sort of what you might expect. But when we look at the marginal effects again, with non-Hispanic white students as the reference group, nearly all of the differences in the predicted probabilities are statistically significant, except for Cubans, Central Americans, Native Americans, and Asians. But when we look at the same thing, but with non-Hispanic Blacks as the reference group, we see the exact same pattern that we saw among males, with Haitians, West Indians, and Dominicans having a statistically similar predicted probability of being suspended from school. And in fact, if you look at the effect sizes, these are actually larger. So the effects, the disadvantages experienced by these groups are actually larger among females than among males, even though it doesn't look that way proportionally, they're larger. And then finally, to sum up here, we find that in general, Black non-Hispanic youth, Haitians, West Indians, and Dominicans are the most likely to be suspended from school. And these patterns are similar among both male and female youth, though some of our analysis, which we didn't really get into, revealed more pronounced disparities among female youth than among male youth. So theoretically, we sort of suggest that these findings may point to the role of colorism in school discipline and suggest that perceptions surrounding something like skin tone may overshadow perceptions surrounding ethnic identity. And this might be especially the case for female students. And our second key finding is that, especially among male students, but also among females as well, we find that Hispanic white disparities, and again, especially among males, are concentrated among Puerto Rican youth. And there are several possibilities for this. One of which is that the Puerto Rican population in Florida, especially in Central Florida, the Orlando area in particular, dramatically expanded since 2010. And especially in the wake of Hurricane Maria. In fact, these data were collected about 6 months after Hurricane Maria, and the number of Puerto Rican kids who were enrolled in Florida schools more than tripled following Hurricane Maria. So this could be an example of what Ulmer and Parker call recent threat that may be unique to Puerto Ricans rather than these other Hispanic subgroups. That's all I had to say for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This is so great. I guess one of the advantages of hosting is I get to listen to all of this. So also an advantage, I don't have to do anything. So Karen, are you ready to take it away?
I think so. I just got, oh, there's share screen. Okay, just give me 1 second.
Just making sure. Perfect.
So you can see and hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. And I just wanted to say an appreciation and thank you to the presenters before me, because I hope that some of these things that I'm going to talk about today are going to just kind of echo and kind of continue on. So it's always great to have, predecessors that are doing great work too. So the title of my talk is Applications of Critical Race Theory and Intersectionality to Black Girls Involved in the Child Welfare and Juvenile Justice Systems. And just to give a brief introduction, my name is Dr. Karen Kolivoski. I am an assistant professor in the School of Social Work at Howard University in Washington, DC. I'm also the data consultant for the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform's Crossover Youth Practice Model at Georgetown University. So my research is focused on crossover youth, and these are young people who have been victims of abuse and neglect and who then engage in delinquency. And oftentimes this involves the child welfare and the juvenile justice systems. I'll focus my talk specifically today on Black girls and how theoretical perspectives can be better used to understand the issues that they specifically face, as well as to set up a research agenda for the future. And this talk is related to a manuscript that I just got accepted for publication in Child and Adolescent Social Work Journal, and that this is conceptual work that I hope will lay the groundwork for empirical research in this area. And for the sake of time, I decided to just put out there my main points on the front end, that I'm going to talk about how crossover youth are a vulnerable population and Black girls are specifically in need of attention, but the empirical and conceptual scholarship hasn't yet caught up to really focus on them as much as we'd like it to. So if we use critical race theory and intersectionality, that these are some theoretical concepts that I think can help in our understanding of how Black girls experience the child welfare and the juvenile justice systems, as well as to inform kind of how we need to proceed in the future with addressing their specific needs. And so just to provide a brief overview about kind of this definition of who are crossover youth, there's various definitions, but the most broad is that crossover youth refer to young people who have been victims of maltreatment, so abuse or neglect, and who then engage in delinquent behavior. This may or may not come to the attention of the child welfare and juvenile justice systems, but oftentimes it does. A lot of the work that I do is focused on how we can improve the child welfare and juvenile justice systems communication and collaboration so that we can improve the outcomes of young people who are kind of finding themselves falling between the cracks and stuck between these two different systems. And just to briefly mention that crossover youth are an especially vulnerable population in terms of a range of adverse life outcomes. So these include being twice the risk of juvenile court contact than non-crossover or non-child welfare youth. They recidivate at higher rates. They're more likely to become involved in the criminal legal system as adults. And that also have increased issues related to mental health and substance use. In terms of the first juvenile arrests, we find that crossover youth are about, on average, 1 year younger than their non-crossover counterparts when they experience their first arrest. In terms of demographics, we often think about delinquency as kind of a boy or a male issue, but when we look at who comprises this group of crossover youth, they're actually more likely to be female, and so girls are especially kind of vulnerable to experiencing these multiple systems. And then across race and ethnicity, they're more likely to be Black, and so Black youth are particularly affected. So if we kind of consider that girls are more affected and Black youth are more affected, I think it's really important that we look at that intersectionality between the two. The other part I just want to mention is that we know that Black youth are overrepresented in the child welfare system. They are overrepresented in the juvenile justice system. So when we talk about young people involved in both of these systems, they're actually even more overrepresented. So I think it's just a very critical issue. Unfortunately, though, the research is still getting caught up on acknowledging how Black girls are particularly susceptible to this child welfare juvenile justice system pipeline. And so that's what I just wanted to focus a little bit of what I'm going to talk about next. So I think it's really important that we have theoretical perspectives that really acknowledge their experiences and really kind of take a critical examination of kind of their involvement in both of these systems. So for the sake of time, I will just kind of touch on some of the broad brush topics that I talk about more in the paper. But if people aren't familiar with critical race theory, CRT is a theoretical framework that examines race, racism, and power, and we can use it to help guide our action strategies for how we're going to address particular issues. Three of the kind of concepts that I focus on specifically is first that racism is so ingrained in US society that oftentimes it's very difficult for people to acknowledge or to recognize it. And so for me, what I'm really hoping to do with this work is to show that too often, I think scholarship focuses on resiliency of youth or how individuals need to adapt to the system and not on how systems themselves play a role in these adverse outcomes. And so for me, the focus of change that I want to kind of fixate on is that systems need to change and not the individuals to fit the systems. So I think it's worth us asking and taking these critical examinations about how we operate our child welfare and our juvenile justice systems, and specifically to ask if white youth were being affected in the same way that Black youth are, would we be operating them the same way and responding to needs the same way that we're doing now? And of course, I would say probably not. The other piece that I just want to mention is in terms of history. So knowing that structural racism needs to be understood within the broader social, economic, and historical context. So I have a previous paper that I published on this that's more specific on acknowledging the history of how Black youth have been excluded from the child welfare and juvenile justice systems and are now overrepresented. And I focus specifically on crossover youth. The last piece is counter storytelling. So acknowledging the importance of youth voices. So on changing the narrative about kind of how we think about these specific issues and making sure that Black girls' voices are being heard about how they experience the child welfare and juvenile justice system. And so that's where I especially appreciate the first presenter, who I know was talking more about adult women further down kind of in their life course, but I just want to acknowledge that I think that's very important that we uplift and amplify those voices. So for the sake of time, I'll move on to briefly mentioning intersectionality. So intersectionality is a lot of components to it, but basically it's acknowledging the interconnected nature of race and gender in understanding issues. And again, I think provides us with action tools that we can use to aim for social change. So with intersectionality, we acknowledge that race and gender can't be understood as separate from one another, but rather are interconnected. And this is where I specifically highlight that few empirical studies focus specifically on Black girls who are experiencing these multiple systems, but rather when we look at young people who are involved in both systems, we tend to just use samples that include everyone and not specifically focusing on Black girls' experiences in and of themselves. And I think that there's validity to doing that. And I think that's where the research is hopefully going to go, but just hasn't caught up yet. And then I'm just going to wrap up with some implications. So on the micro as well as the macro level. So critical race theory really focuses on how structural problems require structural solutions. But I do think there are things that we can all do at the individual level to help eradicate that structural racism. So I would encourage anyone who is familiar, so if like you do your work in the juvenile justice system, to be aware about how the child welfare system operates, that there are similarities and that there's overlap, but there's also differences in terms of mission statement, jargon, kind of conceptualization of who the client is. And so I think it's worth it for any of us who kind of work in one system to be aware about how things operate in another. I also think there's value in taking a critical perspective on the history of these systems and how they have perpetuated social injustices, specifically related to Black girls. And again, I think some of the previous presenters really echoed about how Black youth may experience and systems respond differently to them than if they were white youth. And so just to point out that Black girls are more likely than white girls to be seen as sexually mature and adult-like. And so that's gonna then impact the treatment that they're receiving from systems, and that we need to be aware of how we can change that. On the macro level, really my kind of impetus, or what I really would hope to do, is that doing more research specifically on Black girls and how they experience these multiple systems. I think this can be done both quantitatively and qualitatively in terms of kind of counter storytelling, looking at samples of Black girls specifically. And then just last, acknowledging the diversity within the population. So again, I think previous presenters did a great job of kind of acknowledging that when we think about these racial and ethnic categories, they're often not homogenous, but that there are differences kind of within these categories and broad groups that we tend to put people in. And also within kind of this category of Black girls, acknowledging that intersectionality is not just race and gender, but also the need to look at things like sexual orientation, gender identity, socioeconomic status, kind of et cetera, et cetera. And so for sake of time, I'll kind of cap it there, but I just want to express my appreciation. So here is my email address, my website, and my Twitter if people want to follow up. I wanted to just say thank you to the CrimCon folks for hosting this conference. I'm very just excited to be able to share my work. And the last thing I'll just say is that if you'd like to follow up with me, please feel free to do so. I am on maternity leave, however, at the moment, because I just had a baby last month, but I'm more than happy to talk a lot more about crossover youth at any time. So thank you.
Thank you so much, and congratulations. Babies are just magical.
Thank you.
And smell so good. That's probably why I have 4. Anyways, thank you so much. And just as an aside, I teach at Towson University, so I live like 30 miles away from you, Karen.
I was going to say, I was a postdoc at University of Maryland downtown, so Baltimore, and I did PhD CN data. I saw you present on that yesterday, so we need to follow up.
Yes, we do. All right, great. Aneesa, did I pronounce that correctly?
Yes, you did.
Good, great. So take it away. And just as a reminder, guys, if anybody has any question, you can start putting them in the Q&As so that I'll be ready to so that I can then share it with the group and we can get some Q&A going. All yours.
Okay, thank you. Is it showing up full screen for you?
Yeah. Do you have a
Okay.
double screen?
Yes.
Yeah, that can be. If can you start the presentation and I'll tell you if you need to like move it.
So it's not letting me like. I'll have to do it again.
It honestly looks fine as well. So
Okay, there.
there, it's perfect.
There? Okay, yeah. Sorry, the bar was stopping it from like letting me maximize, but I couldn't do it with the keyboard. Anyway, oops. All right, so good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Dr. Aneesa Baboolal. I am a second-year assistant professor at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. And today I'll be talking to you about an article that I'm working on that comes out of my dissertation, which I finished last spring now. Yeah, last spring. And so my talk is about intersectional Islamophobia. And so I really want to focus more on kind of some background about that, because Islamophobia is really kind of an emerging area in the field recently, and so in the last couple of years. And so there's really not a lot of work around it. And so thinking of Islamophobia as anti-Muslim racism, so rooted in this kind of fear, hatred, and prejudice of not just our societal ideas about the Muslim religion, but also Muslim people, and also those who appear as such. So people who have been racialized as Muslim and as a result have faced victimization in society. And so, for example, we see this after 9/11 with the groups that are targeted, such as Sikhs, for example, for wearing a turban. We also see this among just kind of any other group that's kind of a community of color, an immigrant group. So, for example, after 9/11, we also kind of saw this increase in hate crime violence against Latinos. And so it's really important to understand that anti-Muslim racism in the US context is really kind of rooted in a lot of our stereotypes and perceptions and media depictions of Muslims as terrorists after 9/11, and these kind of stereotypes that have become kind of embedded in different institutions in society. And so we see Islamophobia as really kind of stemming from Orientalism, so the idea of kind of violent others. And we also see this from a gendered lens. And so that's kind of what my focus on will be for about the population that I'm talking about, as I focus particularly on the experiences of Muslim women. And so as I briefly just talked about 9/11, it's really important because a lot of the research we see related to anti-Muslim racism really starts after 9/11, because that's kind of when Muslims are kind of moved from being perceived as this religious group to being perceived as more of a racialized group. And so we see that these kind of race-making implications occur through processes of stereotyping people based on their skin color, having an accent, perceptions of people as immigrants, things like having beards, wearing turbans, wearing the veil, etc. And so after 9/11, we also see from various studies that gendered identity, so particularly wearing a veil, increased women's likelihood of being victimized by as a result of bias incidents. And so this is really critical to my study because I collected data for this study starting in 2016 up until the end of 2018, early 2019, which is kind of a time where we also kind of saw these increases nationally in terms of bias incidents against various marginalized groups. And so now in the literature, we see that some of this is kind of being credited to our ideas, or rather this kind of tolerance of prejudice in society. And during this time, there's really kind of not a lot of data collected about this. So again, it's very similar to after 9/11, where, for example, after 9/11, we still didn't start collecting data about hate crimes against Sikhs. We didn't actually start doing that on a federal level until around 2013. And so with this in mind, I thought it was kind of a really kind of critical time for us to kind of consider what's going on in recent years. And so I started this study by looking at what organizations that serve these groups found. And so at this time, so in the last 2 years or so, what has been found is that the increase against groups that are racialized as Muslims, so whether that's people who are actually Muslim or people who are perceived as such, so South Asian, Sikhs, Hindus, other Middle Eastern people who are not Muslims, this increase has not been as high since 9/11, and more recent data shows that it's actually kind of began to surpass that. But we also see that when we look at violence against Muslim women in particular, that again, there's this kind of consistency in terms of who is being attacked. So specifically women who veil and thus are hyper visible as Muslim in society. And so that means that I have to also give you a bit of background about gendered Islamophobia. So understanding that when we think of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism, traditionally we think of men, right? So the idea of the stereotype of Muslims as terrorists. However, in terms of gendered Islamophobia, there are also ideas about Muslim women in the West or in American society where Muslim women are perceived as backwards and oppressed and as victims of their own kind of culture and religion. And it's really important to keep in mind that it's also really critical that hijabophobia, or this phenomenon that is being considered or called hijabophobia, is something that's becoming more prevalent in the US. So we see it in France and in other European countries where it is socially perceived that if a Muslim woman is veiled in a public space, that this is kind of taken as an offense to Western values, that it is seen as something that kind of sets all women back. And so the Muslim veil in a lot of ways has these kind of cultural and gendered messages that are kind of being interpreted in different ways in society. And so to kind of understand what that means for women in the US in recent years, I used two different theoretical frameworks. I used intersectionality, which Karen talked about a bit. So the idea of examining the kind of intersecting oppression that women face based on gender, race, ethnicity. I also look at citizenship and nationality status, and of course, religion. But as I said earlier, Muslim identity has really moved from being more than just a religion, right? We see it in the context of how Muslims are racialized, but also how other groups are racialized as well. So with that in mind, I also include the literature on racialization of Muslims, which comes out of racial formation theory. So generally the idea that over time, the way that we perceive or label certain racial ethnic groups change based on political and social context. And so I conducted a total of 50 interviews after I conducted a pilot study late in 2016, so right after the election. And I interviewed 50 people who identified as Muslims across various racial identities from a large variety of countries, with a particular focus on people between the ages of 18 and 40. And for this particular talk, I'm just focusing on my interviews with women, and so that there were 27 women in the sample. And so understanding intersectional gendered Islamophobia in terms of public violence, or what we might think of traditionally as kind of street violence or like street harassment, has been a bit different in the experiences of Muslim women. So of course, there's this increased sense of vulnerability that's linked to the way that women are dressed. And so we see this regardless of if someone is wearing a hijab or a niqab. But we also know that there is also this kind of link between skin color and cultural appearance. So even if it's not veiling, but any sort of cultural wear that kind of informs societal perceptions of legal status. So the idea that someone is a perpetual foreigner, which is also linked to Islamophobia. Some of the more important findings that I really want to focus on for this is related to inter and intragender violence in public spaces. So traditionally in the literature, when we look at violence against women in public spaces, men are generally seen as the perpetrators of harassment. And so in the case of my sample, we see that in the case of all women who are veiled, who have experienced violence in some way. However, we also see that there is this intragender factor. So the phenomenon of hijabophobia, which hasn't really been studied in the US, we see that here with my sample in recent years as well. So this is particularly with offenders being older women, and particularly white women with the incidents that were reported from my sample. And so this poses a couple of different kind of barriers when we think about solidarity, also when we think about reporting and ideas of what safety means for women. And so because it's a qualitative study, I did take out a lot of my longer quotes, but I did want to give just some brief examples from women in the sample. So of course, in terms of violence perpetrated by men, we see this in verbal assaults, but we also see it in kind of non-verbal microaggressions that are kind of has really underlying racist connotations, but we also see this in physical incidents. So for example, things being thrown at women, or kind of their instances of their property being attacked, for example, women having their tires slashed. And so some of the examples I included here are, so all of these are incidents where Muslim women are targeted by men in public spaces. So it can be, so for example, Miriam tells a story of, waiting at the bus stop to pick up her kid, and, someone tells her to go back to her country. Or experiences of road rage where women are kind of threatened while they're, on the road, and people are kind of rolling down their windows and saying things that are really kind of rooted in anti-Muslim racism, but also xenophobia. But also something that's really interesting, or what I think is the most interesting finding of the study, is the kind of experiences that Muslim women have in relation to other women. And so the incidents that are perpetrated by women are a bit different because there is kind of less of an aggression factor. So the instances usually start off where women are approached by other women in public spaces, and it may start off in kind of more of like more of a gender dynamic of kind of what are, like in terms of clothing or in terms of appearance. And then it kind of escalates into an anti-Muslim or anti-immigrant, and at other times kind of anti-Black sentiments. So for example, Tahira tells a story of, being at a store, and a woman approaches her and asks her about her hijab, and it turns into, is that a tablecloth that you're wearing? And, and she kind of responds that, kind of like, excuse me, like she didn't understand what she was being told. And then the woman repeats herself and says, are you wearing a tablecloth? What are you doing in my country? Miriam also experienced this kind of similarly, where in a public space, multiple women approach her and they're kind of talking about the way that she's dressed as a costume. So kind of a microaggression, but that's also kind of laced with the anti-Muslim sentiment. And so we see this kind of across the board. However, I also specifically look at the experiences of Black women in the sample, because the experiences of women who exist at the intersection of anti-Muslim, anti-Black, and anti-immigrant sentiment is very unique. So even if Black Muslim women are not immigrants, they are still kind of experiencing the same kind of xenophobic sentiment that other women in the sample experience because of this historical perception of Muslims as foreigners. And so in understanding this, it's really important to remember that when we think about women who are socially invisible Muslim women, so women who are not veiled, the way that they experience harassment is really more similar to how we've traditionally seen street harassment talked about in the literature. However, there is still kind of underlying racist and anti-immigrant tones to this harassment. So for women who don't veil, of course, they are and they're encountering the same kind of regular incidents as other women. However, once they reveal their identity, so what I call their undercover identity or their invisible identity as Muslim to other people, they are then at higher risk, and they then do face some sort of backlash, whether that's microaggressions or physical violence. For women who are veiled and thus are hyper visible because they can immediately be identified as Muslim, the attacks that they face are more directly Islamophobic and xenophobic. And it's really kind of interesting, but also one of the main contributions that I see out of this is kind of who the perpetrators of that violence is. So it's really central to the study to kind of keep in mind that gender-based harassment in this case is not just informed by women's identity, not just their racial and ethnic identity, but how religious identity is perceived and tied to societal perceptions of immigrant or legal status, or the idea of someone as foreigner or not, and what this means in terms of both interracial and also intra-gender contexts. And I do also look at this intra-racially, like in terms of within the Muslim population, and what this kind of means in terms of anti-Black racism within the group, but that's not part of this particular paper, so I'm not going to talk about that. So that's all I'll say about that for now, and I look forward to any questions that anyone has. My contact information is also on PowerPoint. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for these awesome presentations, really informative. We don't have any open questions at the moment. Karen, you have one in the chat if you want to quickly answer it. And then,
Do you want me to answer it out loud or in the
yeah,
chat?
you can.
Oh.
I have at least 3 minutes to spare. I'm just going to warn the new panelists, the ones that are coming in for the next session. I am going to shut down this and open it up again, just because we don't want like a whole video, because it's recording and we don't want 5 hours of just one big block. So I usually shut it down and bring it back up.
So thank you for your question, Lauren. So please do follow up, and hopefully you have my email address. Just really quick, there were a couple of things I wanted to mention in terms of national estimates of young people involved in child welfare and juvenile justice. That's still something that's being worked out, but I wanted to point people to the OJJDP dual system study that Dr. Denise Hers did. So I was going to put it in the chat box, a link to the PDF that has the full study, that this is really the first kind of attempt to get national numbers of young people involved in these multiple systems. And then Lauren mentioned the Cross Youth Practice Model, which I'm a data consultant on. So that report has a bit of CYPM kind of evaluation that I was part of on it. And for people not familiar with the CYPM, it involves bringing together local and state jurisdictions, child welfare professionals, juvenile justice courts to come to the same table to work on young people involved in multiple systems. So it's been implemented in about 120 counties in 23 states. And so as I mentioned before, I'm the data consultant on it. So on a national level, what we're trying to do is take the data that we have from all the different localities that have implemented CYPM and be able to say things more broadly about our evaluation of the program. And then the last thing I'll just kind of mention, and again, Lauren, I hope we can follow up, was that with Missouri, my understanding was that they were counties that were implementing it, but that they were actually one of the first states, if not the first state, to start doing coordinated CYPM efforts. So I'm not sure the current status of things, and you mentioned them being discontinued, but I'd love, like I said, to follow up so I can add my email in there just in case you didn't catch it the first time.
Thank you so much. This was great. And Aneesa, I hope to connect with you. My husband is Muslim, my kids are Muslim. It's great to kind of, I do a lot of immigration research. And so thank you so much, everybody, for attending. I'm going to shut it down. If anybody has any questions, I'm going to speak for the panelists. I'm sorry. I hope you guys all welcome questions. And thank you so much for sharing this research. It's just awe-inspiring. Have a great day, and I hope to see you guys in person post-pandemic. Peter, Ryan, there's a question from Debbie. If you want, you can, I'm just going to close it down and open it back up, and then you can, if you want, you can interact in the chat, if that's cool.
Debbie,